What were the sentences in the Beltway sniper cases?
The October 2002 shootings that left 10 people dead and 3 critically injured in the Washington, D.C. area set off a flurry of legal activity, which was still underway 3 years later. 2 men had been found guilty by juries in separate trials in Virginia in late 2003, John Allen Muhammad, born John Allen Williams 1960-, was sentenced to death, and accomplice Lee Boyd Malvo, aka John Lee Malvo 1985-, received life imprisonment without parole. Since he was a minor at the time of the shooting spree, the death penalty could not be applied in his case. In October 2004, under a plea deal in 2 other Beltway sniper cases, Malvo received other sentences of life imprisonment without parole and 8 years on gun charges. Muhammad and Malvo were arrested on October 24, 2002, in connection with the Beltway sniper attacks. The random shootings, which terrified suburban Washington and gripped the nation, began with a killing in a grocery store parking lot in Wheaton, Maryland, on the evening of October 2. Within the next 16 hours there were 4 more shootings and 4 more dead. By October 22 there were 8 more sniper shootings, 3 of the victims survived. People were targeted as they went about their daily busyness, pumping fuel outside gas stations, loading parcels into their cars in parking lots, arriving at school, and crossing streets. Tips led investigators to issue federal warrants for Muhammad's and Malvo's arrests on October 23, 2002. They were taken into custody early the following morning at a rest stop in Maryland. The 2 men faced charges in several states as well as the District of Columbia. In addition to Virginia and Maryland, the pair had been tied to crimes in the state of Washington, where their journey had begun, as well as in Louisiana, Alabama, and Georgia. In 2005, with Malvo behind bars for life and Malvo awaiting a death sentence, prosecutors still wanted the 2 tried in other cases, as insurance against reversals on appeals and as closure for the families of victims. But legal analysts questioned the high price of further trials, defense costs alone for Muhammad and Malvo, who received court-appointed, and publicly paid, defenders, were expected to near $1 million. The highly publicized sniper shootings added strength to the gun control lobby. According to federal law, neither Muhammad nor Malvo could buy firearms. The weapon they used in their deadly spree was shoplifted from a Tacoma, Washington, gun store. The store owner and the gun manufacturer were named in a civil suit by the Legal Action Project of the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence on behalf of the victims and their families. In 2004, a $2.5 million settlement was reached in the case.
Was despotic Romanian leader Nicolae Ceausescu brought to justice?
In the 1989 trial of Nicolae Ceausescu, 1918 to 1989, and his wife Elena, 1919 to 1989, justice may not have been served. but many believed the tyrannical communist leader of Romania had indeed met with just desserts. The December 25 trial of the Ceausescus lasted all of 60 minutes. 55 minutes of questioning, to which the president's response was, "I do not recognize you, I do not recognize this court," followed by 5 minutes of deliberation. The court and judge were made up of the leaders in the popular rebellion that had begun December 16 when a pro-democracy rally attended by some 350,000 people ended in the Romanian armies and Ceausescu's secret police attacking unarmed demonstrators, killing several hundred men, women, and children. In demonstrations that followed, the Romanian army, long resentful of the privileged status enjoyed by the president's secret police, turned on Ceausescu's government, handing over automatic weapons to insurgents, whom they now joined in a popular uprising. On December 21, state television and radio came under the people's control, as did the Communist Party's central building and the Royal Palace, which were later found to be replete with luxuries and were also connected by a maze of tunnels. The Ceausescus and a few of their close associates tried to flee, but were captured on December 22, the same day that mass graves were found, revealing the secret police's torture and destruction of several hundred men, women, and children. The rebels drove the Ceausescus around for 3 days, averting the still loyal secret police. Realizing that time was not on their side, the captors assembled an extraordinary military tribunal in a small schoolroom at an army barracks. A defense lawyer was provided for Ceausescu. Counsel urged the former president to plead guilty by reason of insanity. He refused. The charges against Ceausescu included genocide, the massacre of demonstrators, and subversion of the economy for his own benefit. 1 hour later, the guilty verdict was delivered. Asked if they wished to appeal the decision, the Ceausescus remained silent. They were promptly taken outside, where a squad opened fire on the former president and his wife. Videotape of the brutal killings. The squad had fired as many as 30 rounds, was shown on Romanian television. By December 30, the country was controlled by rebel forces.
What was the New Deal?
While the Great Depression began with the stock market crash on Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, many factors contributed to the financial crisis, including overproduction, limited foreign markets due to war debts that prevented trading, and overexpansion of credit, as well as stock market speculation. Soon the country was in the grips of a severe economic downturn that affected most every American. Some were harder hit than others, many lost their jobs, 16 million people were unemployed at the depth of the crisis, accounting for about a third of the workforce. Families were unable to make their mortgage payments and lost their homes. Hunger was widespread, since there was no money to buy food. The sight of people waiting in bread lines was a common one. It was amidst this crisis, which was soon felt overseas, that Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, took office as president in 1933. In his inaugural address, he called for faith in America's future, saying, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Roosevelt soon rolled out a program of domestic reforms called the New Deal. For the first time in American history, the federal government took a central role in organizing business and agriculture. Roosevelt initiated aid programs and directed relief in the form of public works programs that would put people back to work. The new government agencies that were set up included the Public Works Administration, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Security and Exchange Commission, National Labor Relations Board, Tennessee Valley Association, the National Recovery Administration, and the Civilian Conservation Corps. These government organizations soon become known by their initials: PWA, FDIC, SEC, NLRB, TVA, NRA, CCC. Roosevelt's critics charged him with giving the federal government too much power and began calling his New Deal alphabet soup. The president became widely known as FDR. Though the New Deal measures alleviated the situation and did put some Americans back to work, the country did not pull out of the Depression until industry was called upon to step up production in order to provide arms, aircraft, vehicles, and supplies for the war effort. It was during the early days of World War II, 1939 to 45. The economy buoyed by military spending, that the nation finally recovered. Many New Deal agencies are still part of the federal government today.
What is the system of scientific management?
A system to gain maximum efficiency from workers and machinery, scientific management. Also known as Taylorism, was developed by American industrial engineer Frederick Winslow Taylor, 1856 to 1915. As foreman in a steel plant, Taylor undertook time and motion studies and conducted experiments to determine the one best way to do any given job, developing detailed systems to yield the highest possible productivity levels. He first presented his theories in 1903 to the American Academy of Mechanical Engineers. Efficiency was the cornerstone of Taylorism. Production processes should not waste time or materials. He published his ideas in the landmark work The Principles of Management, 1911. And became a well-known engineering consultant, contracted by companies eager to maximize their output. The doctrine of scientific management was embraced by American industry. As transportation networks improved and the U.S. population grew rapidly in the early 1900s, markets expanded, placing great demands on industry. Applying Taylor's scientific management, manufacturers were able to boost productivity by as much as 200%. Since Taylorism broke production processes into individual tasks, each with its own best practice, New workers could be quickly and easily trained, which adherents believed was another benefit of the concept. Scientific management had many advocates, including engineers Frank, 1868 to 1924, and Lillian, 1878 to 1972, Gilbreth, who furthered Taylor's work, publishing volumes such as Primer of Scientific Management. 1911, Psychology of Management, 1912, and Studies on Motion, Fatigue, and Time. Among those who applied scientific management were Ford Motor Company, in developing the assembly line for the Model T. Boston retailer Fillings, one of the first commercial enterprises to use the method. And Bethlehem Steel, which conducted experiments in the loading of pig iron. Scientific management also had its detractors. Taylorism was criticized for having a dehumanizing effect on labor. In making every job routine, some charged that the system separated the minds of workers from their hands, eliminated the need for skilled workers, and gave management absolute control over production processes. Nevertheless, principles of scientific management remain evident in the workplace today. And the adoption of scientific management is credited with boosting American productivity and increasing stockholder profits. Theories concerning worker output were modified during the second half of the 20th century.
What was the lasting effect of the Clarence Earl Gideon trials?
A 51-year-old drifter charged with burglary in Panama City, Florida, Clarence Earl Gideon had two trials. In 1961 and 1963. But it's what happened between the two trials that is important to every American today. What might have been pretty standard fare in the day-to-day business of the American justice system? Gideon was charged with robbing a cigarette machine and a jukebox. The Gideon case instead made history when the defendant successfully argued that his constitutional rights had been denied when he was refused an attorney. Though he had a limited education, after a guilty verdict was handed down in his 1961 trial, Gideon knew enough about his rights to petition the Supreme Court, saying that his right to a fair trial, guaranteed by the Sixth Amendment, had been violated. Since he was not able to hire a lawyer to defend himself, the trial had not been fair. The petition, one of thousands the Supreme Court receives each year, somehow rose to the top. The High Court heard Gideon's case and agreed with his conclusion, calling it an obvious truth, and clearly stating that any person haled into court who is too poor to hire a lawyer, cannot be assured a fair trial unless counsel is provided for him. For Gideon, the opinion served to throw out the first trial, for the rest of America. It was assurance that regardless of the crime, a defendant would be guaranteed legal counsel. With the benefit of that counsel, Gideon's case was retried in 1963. He was acquitted on all charges.
What was the anti-apartheid movement?
It was an international movement to throw out the decades-old system of racial segregation in South Africa. The word apartheid means separateness in the South African language of Afrikaans. Under apartheid, which was formalized in 1948 by the Afrikaner Nationalist Party, minority whites were given supremacy over non-whites. The system further separated non-white groups from each other so that mulattoes, those of mixed race, Asians, mostly Indians, and Native Africans were segregated. The policy was so rigid that it even separated native Bantu groups from each other. Blacks were not allowed to vote, even though they were and are the majority population. Apartheid was destructive to the society as a whole and drew protest at home and abroad. But the South African government adhered to the system, claiming it was the only way to keep peace among the country's various ethnic groups. In 1961 the government even went so far as to withdraw from the British Commonwealth in a dispute over the issue. Protesters against apartheid staged demonstrations and strikes, which sometimes became violent. South Africa grew increasingly isolated as countries opposing the system refused to trade with the apartheid government. The no-trade policy had been urged by South African civil rights leader and former Anglican Bishop Desmond Tutu, 1931. Who led a nonviolent campaign to end apartheid and in 1984 won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. During the 1980s the economic boycott put pressure on the white minority South African government to repeal apartheid laws. It finally did so, and in 1991 the system of segregation was officially abolished. White South African leader F.W. de Klerk, 1936, who was elected in 1989, had been instrumental in ending the apartheid system. In April 1994 South Africa held the first elections in which blacks were eligible to vote. Not surprisingly, black South Africans won control of parliament, which in turn elected black leader Nelson Mandela, 1918, as president. De Klerk was retained as deputy president. The two men won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993 for their efforts to end apartheid and give all of South Africa's peoples full participation in government. In 1996 the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a panel headed by Desmond Tutu and charged with investigating the political crimes committed under apartheid, began work. Its investigations continued in 1999, with many findings proving controversial.
When was the New York Stock Exchange founded?
The oldest and largest stock exchange in the United States, the New York Stock Exchange, NYSE, had its origins on May 17, 1792, when local brokers who had been buying and selling securities under a designated tree agreed to formalize their business transactions. The NYSE that most people would recognize today opened for business in 1825 at 11 Wall Street, New York City. At the time most shares traded were in canal, turnpike, mining, and gaslight companies. Though a few industrial securities were first traded on the New York Stock Exchange as early as 1831. It was another 40 years before the complexion of trading changed to a more industrial nature. As the nation became increasingly manufacturing-oriented, the companies listed on the exchange reflected the economic shift. Today, if corporations wish to list their stocks on the NYSE, they must have a minimum of 2,000 shareholders. Each of those original shareholders must have 100 or more shares. The corporation must be able to issue at least 1 million shares of stock. And it must also provide a record of earnings for the previous 3-year period. The board of the stock exchange can make exceptions to these guidelines. Corporations may be listed with other stock exchanges, such as the American Stock Exchange. Or they may allow stock in their company to be traded as unlisted stocks, which are bought and sold in over-the-counter, OTC, trading. Companies that do not allow shares to be publicly traded are called private corporations.
What is the Miranda warning?
Familiar to many Americans from TV police dramas. The Miranda warning is a reading of the arrested person's rights. You have a right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court. You have a right to consult with a lawyer, if you cannot afford a lawyer. One will be appointed for you. Reading the defendant his rights became a requirement. After the 1963 trial of Escobedo Miranda, a Mexican, who was accused of rape, he was found guilty and sentenced to 20 to 30 years imprisonment. But Alvin Moore, Miranda's court-appointed lawyer, had revealed through his questioning of a police officer that the defendant had not been notified of his right to the services of an attorney. The same police officer had taken Miranda's written confession following 2 hours of interrogation. Moore, convinced that the confession should not have been admissible in court because of the procedural error of not informing the defendant of his rights, appealed the Miranda case all the way to the Supreme Court. On June 13, 1966, the High Court ruled, in a 5-4 decision, that Moore was right. Chief Justice Earl Warren, 1891-1974, reasserted that prior to any questioning a person must be warned that he has a right to remain silent. That any statement he does make may be used as evidence against him, and that he has the right to an attorney. Miranda's first trial was thrown out, and in 1967 he again stood trial in Arizona. But the prosecution secured new evidence. The testimonial of his estranged girlfriend that Miranda had confessed to her the rape he was charged with. He was convicted and again sentenced to 20 to 30 years in prison. Released on parole, Miranda died in a bar fight in January 1976. But police officers, the courts, and defendants still remember the importance of the case even if they can't recall Miranda's name or crime. Why is the ruling in Roe v.
What was Black Tuesday?
It was the day the stock market crashed Tuesday, October 29, 1929, signaling the beginning of the worldwide economic downturn called the Great Depression, 1929-39. On Thursday, October 24, 1929, stock values declined rapidly following a 5-year period in which the average price of common stocks on the New York Stock Exchange had more than doubled. The prosperity of the 1920s and the widespread sale and purchase of Liberty bonds, U.S. government bonds, to help finance World War I, 1914-18, had encouraged many Americans to invest in the stock market. With the market robust, timing seemed right for speculation, and America's experience with Liberty bonds had made many people comfortable with and interested in investments. So when the stock market dropped precipitously on that fateful October day in 1929, the effects were felt by many. On the following Monday, prices again plummeted. On Tuesday, October 29, stockholders panicked, selling off more than 16.4 million shares, and prices nosedived. Institutions were also affected, banks, also investors, lost huge sums of money, forcing many to close their doors. News of the stock market failure and bank closures caused many Americans to try to withdraw their money from their deposit accounts, leading to the famous run on the banks. The late October financial crises marked the beginning of a decade of hard times.
What was the dot-com bubble?
The dot-com bubble was a phenomenon of the late 1990s, when there was unguarded optimism for internet-based businesses. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, a bubble has long been defined as anything fragile, unsubstantial, empty, or worthless, since the 17th century. The word has been applied to delusive commercial or financial schemes. .com refers to a commercial internet venture, which most often carries the .com suffix in its URL, or internet address. The .com bubble inflated quickly. The graphical user interface, GUI, of the World Wide Web, with point-and-click hyperlinks, was integrated into the previously academic-oriented Internet in the early 1990s, making it more user-friendly for the average person. Public use of the Internet expanded rapidly. Existing businesses realized they needed a presence on the Internet for information or marketing purposes, if not for commerce. The promise of conducting business online, where costs were wrongly judged to be low, spurred entrepreneurs. New businesses began popping up to take advantage of the commercial or e-commerce possibilities, Of the net, these were the start UPS. They often had no real-world, or bricks-and-mortar, correlation. They strived to make money by reaching consumers only over the internet. Among the start UPS of the dot-com bubble were Amazon, eBay, eDois, WebMD, HotJobs, and Monster. Startups were known by several characteristics, because of investor optimism about e-commerce. Startups had quick access to venture capital funds, their managers were usually young, risk-taking Genzers, some of whom were unsalaried workers who signed on for the promise of big earnings through stock options. They spent lavishly on their office spaces and on employee perks, they conducted expensive advertising and marketing campaigns. And, when taken public on the stock market, in an IPO, or initial public offering, the original owners and investors were known to make huge amounts of money, at least on paper. Once the dot-coms were on the stock market, the technology-heavy Nasdaq was home to many. Individual investors became enchanted with them, artificially inflating their stock prices, even when many companies had yet to earn a dime. The price-to-earnings ratio, or PE, a measure of performance used by investors, became virtually meaningless when applied to the dot-coms. The height of the dot-com bubble was the January 2000 Super Bowl, when almost 20 dot-com companies paid more than $2 million each for prime advertising spots. On March 10, 2000, the Nasdaq index of leading technology peaked at 5,048.62. A year earlier the index was less than half that. Right around 2,500, and a year later it hovered around 2,000, or about 40% of its peak. In spring 2005 the Nasdaq Composite Index was below 2,000. Some called the March 2000 burst cataclysmic, but other analysts and investors saw the end of the dot-com bubble as a necessary correction, or thinning, after which earnest players could get on with building internet-based businesses that would be successful in the long run. Whatever the view, the dot-com bubble was the biggest market bubble ever seen, and many investors lost big.
What is solidarity?
It was a worker-led movement for political reform in Poland during the 1980s, and it led to the downfall of communism. The movement was inspired by Pope John Paul II's June 1979 visit to his native Poland, where, in Warsaw, he delivered a speech to millions, calling for a free Poland and a new kind of solidarity. As scholar and author Timothy Garton Ash noted, without the Pope, no solidarity. Without solidarity, no Gorbachev. Without Gorbachev, no fall of communism. Shipyard electrician Lech Walesa, 1943, became the leader of Solidarity. Formed in 1980 when 50 labor unions banded together to protest Poland's communist government. The unions staged strikes and demonstrations. By 1981 Solidarity had gained so many followers that it threatened Poland's government, which responded, with the support of the Soviet Union, by instituting martial law in December of that year. The military cracked down on the activities of the unions. Abolishing Solidarity in 1982 and arresting its leaders, including the charismatic Walesa. But the powerful People's Movement, which had also swept up farmers who formed the Rural Solidarity, could not be suppressed. Martial law was lifted in mid-1983, but the government continued to exert control over the people's freedom. That year Walesa received the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to gain workers' rights and prevent violence. Solidarity continued its work for reform. In 1989, the collapse of communism on the horizon, people's movements in Eastern Europe had combined with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost to herald the system's demise. The Polish government reopened negotiations with Solidarity's leadership. Free elections were held that year, with the Labour Party candidates gaining numerous seats in parliament. In 1990 Walesa was elected president, at which time he resigned as chairman of Solidarity. Poland's Communist Party was dissolved that year.
What is a Horatio Alger story?
It is any story about someone who, through sheer determination and good works, rises from poverty to wealth. During the second half of the 1800s, novels by American clergyman and author Horatio Alger Jr. (1832 to 1899) were extremely popular. He wrote more than 100 books, including the Luck and Pluck and the Tattered Tom series. All of the stories center on a boy from inauspicious beginnings who, through hard work, clean living, and a little bit of luck, becomes successful. Alger's real-life experience working with orphans and runaways in New York City provided the foundation for his works, which inspired countless readers and fed into the American dream that the United States is a land ripe with possibility. Though dead for more than a century, Alger's name lives on. Many Americans still describe an honorable person's rise from rags to riches as a real Horatio Alger story.
Wade controversial?
The 1973 Supreme Court decision in the case of Roe v. Wade legalized abortion in the United States and has probably engendered more public controversy than any other legal decision of the late 20th century. Women's access to safe abortion continues to be the subject of debate. At issue in legal cases, and has inspired overzealous anti-abortion activists to violence against doctors who perform abortions and office workers in women's health clinics. The 7 Supreme Court justices who issued the majority decision became the recipients of thousands of letters of hatred, some of them threatening. The case was brought as a class action suit, representing all pregnant women, by 21-year-old Norma McCorvey, 1947. Who has since the ruling reversed her feeling and joined the anti-abortion camp as a right-to-life advocate. But in 1969, under the alias Jane Roe, McCorvey claimed that Texas's abortion law, on the books since 1859, violated her constitutional rights and those of other women. The other party named in the case was Texas District Attorney Henry B. Wade, 1914 to 2001, who argued to uphold Texas state law that punished anyone who gave an abortion. Despite the fact that the ruling in the case would do nothing to help McCorvey, for whom even a favorable decision would come too late to end her unwanted pregnancy, her lawyers, Linda Coffey and Sarah Weddington, agreed to pursue the case as a test. The crux of the plaintiff's case is best summed up by arguments made before the Supreme Court, when in December 1971, Weddington argued that Texas's ability to compel women to bear children infringed on a woman's right to control her own life. It was therefore a violation of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, which forbids states to make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens. In response to defense claims that the fetus is entitled to protection, Weddington averred, "The Constitution as I read it, attaches protection to the person at the time of birth." These arguments, and those of the defense, were presented twice to the Supreme Court. After the first presentation, the 7 justices then seated concluded that such an important decision should not be made until the 2 newly appointed justices could participate. In October 1972 the case was heard again. As it turned out, the 2 new judges represented 1 majority vote and 1 dissenting vote. The majority decision was read by Justice Harry Blackmun on January 22, 1973. The High Court overturned all state laws restricting women's access to abortions. The decision was based on the court's opinion that existing laws banning abortions had been enacted to protect the health of American women, since abortion had previously been a risky medical procedure, and that with advances in medicine this protection was no longer necessary or valid. The court also agreed that the Constitution's implied right to privacy, as found in the 14th Amendment's concept of personal liberty, or in the 9th Amendment's reservation of rights to the people, is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision to terminate her pregnancy. 2 justices dissented in the opinion, with Justice Byron White writing that the court had sustained a position that values the convenience, whim or caprice of the putative mother more than life or the potential life of the fetus. Nearly 3 decades after the landmark decision, opinion continues to divide along such lines.
What was the Gang of Four?
The Gang of Four was a group within China's Communist Party that, under the leadership of Mao Zedong's wife, Jiang Qing, 1914 to 1991, 21 years his junior, carried out its own power-hungry agenda and plotted the takeover of the government from Chairman Mao, 1893 to 1976. A former stage and movie actress, Zhang was also an astute student of politics. In the late 1960s, at which time she had been married to Mao for some 30 years, she became associated with former army commander Lin Biao, and the pair conspired to stage a coup. In 1970, at a Communist Party conference, they announced that Lin had surpassed Mao as the leader of the people. 1 year later, Lin and Zhang tried to overthrow Mao's government. Failing, Lin fled the country. His plane was later shot down, and Zhang succeeded in covering up her involvement in the affair. But she continued her subversive activities, associating with 3 other members of the Politburo, the chief executive and political committee of the Communist Party. In 1974, Mao publicly admonished his wife and her cohorts, Wang Hongwen, Yao Wenyuan, and Zhang Chunqiu, to cease their power-seeking activities. Infighting in the party had already resulted in Mao's loss of influence. 2 years later, on September 9, 1976, Mao died. The Gang of Four were arrested and thrown into prison. There they remained for years while the case against them was formulated, resulting in an indictment that consisted of 20,000 words. Finally, on November 20, 1980, the Gang of Four expanded to include 6 other conspirators, were put on trial charged with counter-revolutionary acts, including sedition and conspiracy to overthrow the government, persecution of party and state leaders, suppression of the people, and plotting to assassinate Mao. During nearly 6 weeks of testimony, Jiang's machinations were revealed to the 600 representatives who attended the trial, held in an Air Force auditorium in western Beijing. As well as to the Chinese press, foreign press was prohibited from attending. Her laundry list of malicious acts as ringleader of the Gang of Four included public humiliation and even torture of Communist Party rivals, execution of her personal enemies, inspiring the fear of the masses, and purging the arts of anything that did not carry a revolutionary theme. Zhang, while not denying many of these acts, insisted that she had all along acted at the behest of her husband, Mao. During the explosive testimony and presentation of evidence, which included tapes and documents substantiating the state's case against Zhang, she made outbursts, was temporarily expelled from the courtroom, was dragged screaming from the courtroom twice, and even taunted her accusers into executing her, saying it would be more glorious to have my head chopped off. In the end, Zhang and 1 other conspirator were found guilty and sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison. And the 8 others were also found guilty and charged with sentences ranging from 16 years to life in prison. Zhang died on May 14, 1991, in what appeared to be a suicide.
How old is nationalism?
Nationalism, a people's sense that they belong together as a nation because of a shared history and culture. and often because of a common language and or religion, emerged at the close of the Middle Ages, 500-1350. By the 1700s several countries, notably England, France, and Spain, had developed as nation-states. Groups of people with a shared background who occupy a land that is governed independently. As political and economic entities, the nation-states were preceded by fiefs, tribes, city-states, and empires, which overlapped each other as organizing units, dividing people's loyalties. By the 1800s nationalism had become a powerful force, and the view took hold that any national group has the right to form its own state. Because of this belief, called national self-determination, some nations achieved independence, including Greece, which gained freedom from Turkey in 1829, and Belgium, which won self-rule from the Netherlands in 1830. Others formed new, larger countries. Both Italy and Germany were created by the unification of numerous smaller states, Italy in 1870 and Germany 1 year later. And still others carved smaller states out of great empires, for example, the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire following World War I 1914-18 resulted in the formation of the independent countries of Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and, later, Yugoslavia. In the United States, nationalism in the 1800s took the form of manifest destiny. The mission to expand the country's boundaries to include as much of North America as possible. By the end of the century, the United States had claimed all of its present-day territory. While nationalism is a source of pride and patriotism and has had many positive results, some leaders, notably German dictator Adolf Hitler 1889-1945, have carried it to extremes, initiating large-scale movements that resulted in the persecution of other peoples and in the hideous practice of ethnic cleansing. The boundary lines that were drawn on the world map at the end of the 20th century were largely the result of nationalistic movements, some of which had resulted in conflicts and some of which remained unresolved.
Why was Ford's Model T important?
The enormous success of the Model T, a Ford Motor Company car introduced in 1908 and manufactured until 1927, has been the source of extensive analysis and commentary by historians, sociologists, economists, business writers, and pop culture experts. The Model T has been credited with not only changing America but with defining it. When Ford Motor Company founder and President Henry Ford, 1863-1947, unveiled the prize Model T in October 1908, he hailed it as a motor car for the great multitude. The product lived up to the promise. The internal combustion vehicle had been in production in the United States only since the 1890s. But in the decade preceding the Model T's debut, manufacturers and consumers alike had come to regard the horseless carriage as a luxury item, custom-made for wealthy Americans. Ford had conceived of a different and, as the company would advertise throughout the century. A better idea, a car that was simple to operate, easy to service, comfortable, and affordable. The Model T had a wooden body on a steel frame, 4-cylinder, 20 horsepower engine. Tank capacity of 10 gallons, in the touring sedan, or 16 gallons. In the runabout, and a completely enclosed power plant and transmission. It was also lighter than other models. Through large-scale production, based on a system of interchangeable parts. The Model T took 728 minutes, just more than 12 hours, to build and sold for $850, lower than the price of other automobiles. But still beyond the reach of the average American. Nevertheless, 17,000 Model Ts were bought by American consumers the year they were introduced. Ford improved production methods to realize greater economies and lower the price each year. Sales steadily rose. The company raised eyebrows in the business community when it offered workers an 8-hour day for $5 a day, twice what other factory workers were earning. Ford explained that this was merely good business practice. By raising the wages of his factory workers, Ford enlarged the potential market for his Model T. In 1914, Ford implemented the moving assembly line. It used the principles of scientific management, where each job has one best way of being accomplished, to bring unprecedented efficiency to manufacturing. Assembly time per car dropped to just 90 minutes. That year the Ford plant in Highland Park, Michigan, produced almost 250,000 Model Ts. To keep up with ever-rising demand, operations were sped up and capacity increased to the point that one day in 1925, Ford produced one Model T every 10 seconds. That year the car retailed for just $295, making the so-called Tin Lizzie, or the Flivver, accessible to working-class families. By 1927, when Ford retired the Model T so the company could respond to consumer demand for cars with better performance, power, and styling, the company had turned out 15 million Tin Lizzies. Ford's innovative Model T, a reliable, no-nonsense, mass-produced automobile. Manufactured on a moving assembly line, brought mobility within the reach of the average American. It had changed consumer mindset to view the car as a necessity.
What was the nonviolent Indian reform movement?
It was the movement led by Indian nationalist leader Mohandas Gandhi, 1869 to 1948. Whose methods of protest included staging boycotts, fasting, conducting prayer vigils, and visiting troubled areas in an attempt to end conflicts. Gandhi, whom the people called Mahatma, meaning great-souled, was determined to bring about change in India to bring an end to British control of the country, and to topple the ages-old caste system, the strict social structure, there. Gandhi believed that it took great courage to not engage in violence. And he began campaigns of passive resistance, which he called satyagraha, meaning firmness in truth. Gaining a wide following, Gandhi's acts of civil disobedience did bring about changes in his homeland, where he is revered as the founder of an independent India, 1947. He remained faithful to his nonviolent beliefs throughout his life. He also adhered to a firm policy of religious tolerance. It was for this reason that the spiritual and nationalist leader was killed by a Hindu extremist in 1948.
Who invented the assembly line?
Ford Motor Company founder Henry Ford, 1863 to 1947, is credited with the creation of the assembly line, an industrial innovation that allowed cars to be produced quickly and efficiently. In 1913, 10 years after founding Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford installed the first moving assembly line in one of his Model T manufacturing plants. The innovation proved to be the beginning of the consumer age. The assembly line allowed greater efficiencies in auto production, which, in turn, reduced the price of a quality car, putting it in reach of the ordinary person. Soon, manufactured goods of every variety would be mass-produced.
What was Black Friday?
The term refers to one of two Fridays in the second half of the 1800s when severe market drops precipitated financial crises in the United States. The first Black Friday was September 24, 1869, financiers J. Gould, 1836–1892, and James Fisk, 1834–1872, had conspired to raise the market price of gold by buying it in huge quantities, leaving less supply on the open market, which would, theoretically, increase demand and therefore price. Having caused the price to increase, the businessmen planned to sell their gold supplies at a profit. While they did make out handsomely, clearing some $11 million, a panic resulted when the price of gold rose sharply. Businesses that needed gold to meet their obligations were forced to pay exorbitant prices for it. The government responded to the crisis by selling off $4 million of its gold reserves, causing gold prices to tumble. Speculators were hit hard, but Gould and Fisk came out unscathed, selling off their gold supplies before the price plummeted. 4 years later, another Friday turned dark when the investment banking firm of J. Cook and Company failed after it had invested too heavily in railroad securities, which had since declined. When news of the company's collapse was released on September 19, 1873, it affected the entire stock market, and prices fell sharply. The so-called Panic of 1873 signaled the beginning of a depression that persisted through most of the 1870s.
What is Zionism?
Zionism was founded as the nationalist movement to establish an independent Jewish state. It began in the 1890s, and roughly 50 years later, in 1948. The movement's activism resulted in the proclamation of the State of Israel. Since that time, Zionism has focused its efforts on building bridges between Israel and Jewish people around the world. The roots of Zionism date to 1882, when a movement began encouraging Jewish settlement of Palestine. The region in the Middle East, in Southwest Asia, that borders the Mediterranean Sea to the west, Lebanon to the north, Syria and Jordan to the east, and Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, to the southwest. Groups advocating immigration to the Jewish homeland in Palestine called themselves Lovers of Zion. Havavei Zion. Mount Zion is the site in Jerusalem where the Temple of David, king of the ancient Hebrews, d. 962 BC, was built, and it is therefore considered the center of Jewish spiritual life. As a political movement, Zionism was founded in the late 1890s by Austrian journalist Theodor Herzl, 1860 to 1904. In 1894 Herzl was among the reporters covering the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, a French army officer falsely convicted of treason. Though the artillery captain, who was Jewish, was later declared innocent. The guilty verdict rendered in his first trial was annulled. Many felt the Dreyfus case had exposed a deep vein of anti-Semitism in Europe. Herzl's conclusion was that if anti-Semitism could take hold in France, it could prevail anywhere. Based on this belief, he began working for the reclamation of a Jewish state in the Middle East. In 1897 Herzl convened the First Zionist Congress, held in Basel, Switzerland, bringing the movement to worldwide attention. In 1917, against the backdrop of World War I, 1914-18, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour, 1848-1930, issued a declaration vowing his country's support for a national Jewish homeland in Palestine. This came after British troops liberated the Middle East from the control of the Ottoman Empire. In 1920 the Ottoman Empire dissolved as part of the conclusion of World War I, and by international agreement the British were given rule over Palestine. Numerous Jews immigrated to Palestine, where fighting broke out with Arabs who opposed Jewish resettlement. Previously boosted by British support of an independent Jewish state, Zionists received a heavy blow in 1937 when, with another conflict in Europe on the horizon, Britain reversed its policy in Palestine in an effort to gain Arab support should fighting break out with Germany. At the end of World War II, 1939-45, Britain turned over the problem in the Middle East to the newly created United Nations, which decided that out of Palestine, both an independent Jewish state and a self-ruling Arab state should be formed. In 1948 the State of Israel was declared by Polish-born and Zionist moderate David Ben-Gurion. 1886-1973, who became head of the nation's provisional government. The World Zionist Congress was later separated from the government. The organization has since turned its attention to immigration and cultural activities. German-born scientist Albert Einstein, 1897 to 1955, was among Zionism's most prominent adherents.
What was Y2K?
Y2K means year 2000, K is a metric abbreviation for thousand. In the late 1990s, the term was most often coupled with problem or bug to refer to a potentially disastrous computer programming peculiarity. Over decades of programming and in trillions of lines of code, developers had truncated the 4-digit year to 2 digits as a space-saving mechanism, so that 1999 was rendered as 99. It was therefore feared that many computer programs, as well as simple chips in VCRs, watches, and other consumer devices, might malfunction, reading 00 not as 2000 but as 1900, or not recognize it at all. The problem was a concern for every sector of the global economy, but it was feared to have a particularly ruinous impact on the mainframe computer systems that are the backbone of operations for banks and other financial institutions. Electric utilities, water systems, communication systems, oil and gas companies, and government entities, such as the Department of Defense and the Social Security Administration. In the second half of the 1990s, business and government developed solutions to the Y2K problem. Or the millennial bug, readiness was gauged periodically to encourage the sharing of best practices across and between industries. The federal government passed the year 2000 Information and Readiness Disclosure Act, signed October 1998. Despite assurances that the Y2K bug had been fixed, much of the public met the year 2000 with at least a bit of trepidation, some people having made emergency preparations, such as stocking up on food and water, buying generators, and stashing away cash. Though there were isolated glitches, no major problem surfaced. Thanks to rectification efforts, the foretold Y2K crisis never materialized. But the cost of fixing the problem was high. It had an estimated $1.5 trillion price tag.
What was Enron?
Enron was a high-flying energy trading and communications company headquartered in Houston, Texas. It was the seventh largest corporation in the United States, a favorite on Wall Street. And for 6 years in a row, 1996 to 2001, was named America's most innovative company by Fortune magazine. Then Enron filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in December 2001. Rocking the business world and shocking investors and rank-and-file employees. It was, for a short time, the largest bankruptcy in American history. Federal investigators later learned that the company's collapse was caused by fraudulent accounting practices that allowed Enron to overstate earnings and hide debts. The conglomerate had booked billions in profits that did not really exist and created mythical companies to bury heavy losses. Enron's stock price plummeted, there were massive layoffs, employee retirement accounts. Heavily invested in Enron stock, were decimated, executives resigned, and criminal indictments followed. Its accounting firm, Chicago-based Arthur Andersen, collapsed under the weight of its involvement in the scandal. Enron soon became emblematic of a much larger problem, the so-called breakdown of corporate America. It was the first of several colossal business failures, the biggest of which was the collapse of telecom giant WorldCom. In July 2002, WorldCom, valued at $180 billion and serving 15 million customers at its 1999 peak, filed for bankruptcy. WorldCom eclipsed Enron to earn the dubious title of largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. Again, fraudulent business practices were to blame. In March 2005, a federal jury convicted former WorldCom Inc. CEO Bernard Ebbers of engineering $11 billion in fraud. He was also found guilty of conspiracy and of filing false financial reports. The conviction was critical to prosecutors in a host of pending cases connected to corporate scandals, including Enron, whose former chairman, Kenneth Lay, and former CEO, Tom Skilling, were awaiting trial, set for 2006. A Fortune magazine writer reflected on the crisis of corporate ethics, saying, "Phony earnings, inflated revenues. Conflicted Wall Street analysts, directors asleep at the switch. This isn't just a few bad apples, it is a systemic breakdown." Enron happened to be first, and it became the symbol for the many. In 2005, Enron was in the process of distributing remaining assets to creditors and liquidating other operations. WorldCom, meanwhile, emerged from bankruptcy in 2004 as MCI Inc., the name of one of its subsidiaries.
What was the first mail order company?
The mail order business was pioneered by retailer Montgomery Ward and Company. Founded in 1872 in Chicago when American merchant Aaron Montgomery Ward, 1843 to 1913, set up shop over a livery stable and printed a one-sheet catalog of bargains. Midwestern farmers, hurt by low farm prices and rising costs, were a ready market for the value-priced goods, which were shipped by rail to rural customers. Originally called the Original Grange Supply House, Montgomery Ward offered 30 dry goods priced at $1 or less and provided special terms of sale for Grange members. The Grange is an association of farmers. Ward bought merchandise directly from wholesalers and, since he did not maintain a store building, overhead was low. By 1876 Ward's catalog had grown to 150 pages, in 1884 it was 240 pages and offered nearly 10,000 products, including household items, such as furniture, cutlery, and writing paper. Farm implements, such as harnesses and tools, and fashions, such as ready-made apparel and parasols. Ward offered customers satisfaction or your money back. In 1886, American Richard W. Sears, 1863 to 1914, entered the mail order business, opening operations in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He moved the business to Chicago the following year and sold it in 1889. In 1893 he joined with Alva C. Roebuck, 1864 to 1948, to found Sears, Roebuck and Company. The Sears catalog, which soon consisted of hundreds of pages and thousands of items, became popularly known as the Wish Book. Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck were aided by the U.S. Postal Service's expansion into remote areas. Beginning in 1896, mail could be delivered via the RFD, Rural Free Delivery. In 1913, parcel post was added to the Postal Service's offerings, further benefiting the mail order houses and their growing lists of customers. Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck offered rural America more than merchandise. The mail order houses were farm families linked to the greater consumer society that was emerging at the turn of the century. Regardless of geography, rural Americans could purchase store-bought goods. Manufactured goods that were mass-produced in factories. The mail order houses offered customers convenience, since customer purchases no longer had to be deferred for the next trip to a town. Variety, since catalogers catered to a nationwide customer base. On-hand inventory included a multitude of products, and low prices. The mail order houses bought merchandise at reduced rates from the wholesalers. Fashions were no longer restricted to the middle and upper-class city dwellers who had access to department stores. Rural customers became aware of new styles each time the Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck catalogs were delivered, which, by the early 1900s, was twice a year. Though both Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck exited the mail order business to concentrate efforts on their chain store retail operations later in the century, they set the standard for modern mail order houses through their early policies addressing merchandise returns, competitive pricing, flexible payment methods, and shipping terms.
What does laissez-faire mean?
From the French, laissez-faire literally means to let people do as they choose. As an economic doctrine, laissez-faire opposes government interference in economic and business matters, or at least desires to keep government's role to an absolute minimum. Laissez-faire favors a free market, a market characterized by open competition. The theory was popularized during the late 18th century as a reaction to mercantilism. Noted Scottish economist Adam Smith, 1723 to 1790, was among the advocates of a laissez-faire market.
What is capitalism?
The cornerstones of capitalism are private ownership of property, capital goods. Property and capital create income for those who own the property or capital. Individuals and firms openly compete with one another, with each seeking its own economic gain. So that competition determines prices, production, and distribution of goods. And participants in the system are profit-driven, in other words, earning a profit is the main goal. Capitalism is the antithesis of socialism. A theory by which government owns most, if not all, of a nation's capital. There is no pure capitalist system. National governments become involved in the regulation of business to some degree. But the economy of the United States is highly capitalistic in nature, as are the economies of many other industrialized nations, including Great Britain.
When did the anti-slavery movement begin?
In the United States, the campaign to prohibit slavery strengthened in the early 1800s. Across the Atlantic, abolitionists had successfully lobbied for the outlaw of slave trade in Great Britain by 1807. The following year, the U.S. government also outlawed the trade, but possession of slaves remained legal and profitable. In the 1830s, the call to abolish slavery and emancipate slaves became an active movement in the United States, precipitated by a revival of evangelical religion in the North. Abolitionists, believing slavery is morally wrong and violates Christian beliefs, called for an end to the system, which had become critical to the agrarian economy of the southern states, where plantations produced cotton, tobacco, and other crops for domestic and international markets.
When did the anti-slavery movement begin?
In the United States, the campaign to prohibit slavery strengthened in the early 1800s. Across the Atlantic, abolitionists had successfully lobbied for the outlaw of slave trade in Great Britain by 1807. The following year, the U.S. government also outlawed the trade, but possession of slaves remained legal and profitable. In the 1830s, the call to abolish slavery and emancipate slaves became an active movement in the United States, precipitated by a revival of evangelical religion in the North. Abolitionists, believing slavery is morally wrong and violates Christian beliefs, called for an end to the system, which had become critical to the agrarian economy of the southern states, where plantations produced cotton, tobacco, and other crops for domestic and international markets.